it's Megan here from Meghan Makes Do, and today I'm going to show you how to crochet the Marlowe Tote. Isn't she so cute and so huge? I absolutely love it. This is a free crochet pattern available on my blog, so if you want to follow along with the written instructions, the link to that blog post is in the description below. She takes 7 skeins of Lion Brand's Rewind yarn, which is a tape yarn, and we're going to use the braided puff stitch all the way throughout. So if you want a giant, huge tote bag for the summer, this is definitely what you want to make today. So let's go ahead and get started. For today's tutorial, we're going to be using Lion Brand yarn Rewind tape yarn. This is a really fun yarn. It's flat like tape. It's super soft, and it comes in a variety of beautiful colors. This is a bulky 5-weight yarn, so if you're looking for a sub, make sure that you use another 5-weight yarn or a similar tape yarn. I'll also be using a J crochet hook, which is a 6mm hook. This one is from Knitter's Pride that I got from Jimmy Bean's Wool. I'll put links below to the yarn and hooks and all the materials that I'm using for today's tutorial. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so to make our tote bag, we're going to be making 2 identical panels and then seaming them together. So to start your panel, we're going to be working from the bottom of our panel, working up, and we are going to start with a slip knot, and then we are going to chain 47. Okay, so now that I have my 47 chains, for row 1, we're going to skip the first chain and then work a single crochet into the second chain from the hook and in each chain stitch all the way to the end. So we'll end up with 46 single crochet for row 1. Okay, so now we're working our last single crochet of row 1. And now we get to the fun part where we start working our braided puff stitch. So I'm going to chain 1 and turn my work. And so for row 2, we are going to single crochet into the first stitch. And now when we're working our puff stitches, we're actually going to be working 2 rows below. So in the next stitch, normally we'd work right here into this stitch, but we're going to work 2 rows below. So we're actually going to kind of be going back into the chain stitch row. So I'm going to yarn over, insert my hook in the next stitch 2 rows below, yarn over and draw up a loop, yarn over, insert hook into the same stitch, yarn over, draw up a loop, and we're going to do that one more time. Yarn over, insert hook into the same stitch, remember 2 rows below, yarn over and draw up a loop. So you should have a total of 7 loops on your hook. Then you're going to yarn over and draw through all of those loops, all 7. Then we're going to chain 1 and we're going to keep going. So we're going to skip the next stitch, and then in the next stitch, remember normally we work up here, but we're going to be working 2 rows below. So whenever we make a puff stitch, we're going to work 2 rows below. So I'm going to work my puff stitch in the second stitch from my current stitch, 2 rows below. And again, you draw through all loops on your hook and then chain 1. And we're going to repeat this all the way across until we have 2 stitches left. So again, skip the next stitch and then work a puff stitch 2 rows below. So kind of going into that chain again. So one more time, we're going to skip the next stitch and then puff into the next 2 rows below. And then yarn over and draw through all loops on the hook, chain 1, and repeat all the way across until you only have 2 stitches left. Okay, so now I have 2 stitches left, and I've already chained 1, so I'm going to skip the next stitch, and then I'm going to single crochet into the last stitch, and I'm going to do that into the normal spot where we would work our stitch, so into like that working row. So that's the end of row 2. So we're going to chain 1 and turn, and this is where we're going to get into creating that braided effect with the puff stitches. So for row 3, and for all subsequent rows, at least for the initial setup part that we're going to be making, we're going to single crochet into the first stitch, and we're going to do that right into the working row. So now for our puff stitch, we are going to be working that into the single crochet, that first single crochet, but 2 rows below. So right here is where we're going to work our first puff stitch. So single crochet into the first stitch of the working row, and then puff stitch into the first single crochet 2 rows below. And again, we draw through all 7 loops, and then we chain 1. So you can see we're going to skip a stitch. This is the chain stitch, we're skipping that, and then we're also skipping over the puff stitch, which is right here. We want to be working into this single crochet stitch right here. So we're going to skip a stitch and then work a puff stitch into the next stitch 2 rows below, which is a single crochet for this row. So 1, 2, 3, and then draw through all 7 loops and chain 1, and we're going to repeat that over and over all the way until we have 2 stitches left. So we're skipping the puff stitch, and then we're working our next puff stitch into the next stitch, which normally would be here, but we're going to work 2 rows below, and we're going into the single crochet stitch and then kind of working around our working row. Okay, and again, puff stitch into the single crochet stitch 2 rows below. Chain 1, skip 1, puff stitch into the single crochet 2 rows below. Just like this. And again, just repeat that all the way across your row until we have 2 stitches left. Okay, so I'm working a puff stitch 2 rows below. This is my last puff stitch of the row. Okay, so actually I misspoke. We're gonna have technically three stitches left. So I'm gonna skip the chain stitch and the puff stitch, the tops of those, and then I'm just going to single crochet into the last stitch. So just like that. And you can kind of start to see that we're kind of going to be moving our puff stitches back and forth to get that braided effect. So now I'm going to chain 1 and turn and get ready to work row 4. So for row 4, we are going to start the same way we started the last row. So we're going to single crochet into the top of the first stitch of our working row. And then for our puff stitch, again, working into the first stitch 2 rows below. So we're going into that single crochet, but 2 rows below, and working our first puff stitch. Okay, drawing through all 7 loops and then chaining 1. Okay, so now we're going to again be working 2 rows below. We are skipping over that first puff stitch, and we want to be working into the puff stitch, the top of the puff stitch, 2 rows below. It can be hard to see. You're going to have to kind of pull the working rows puff stitch over to the right a little bit in order to see it. So just know you're working into the top of the puff stitch. So skip over the working rows puff stitch and chain stitch, and then work into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below. Just like that. So again, and then chain 1. Again, we're skipping over the working puff stitch, and we're going to work into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below. So I know it can be kind of confusing with where the puff stitch versus the chain stitch is, but we're actually going to be always working into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below. And here you can really start to see that braided effect. So again, move over so you can get into that stitch. So move that working puff row over, and you're going to work into that stitch right to the left of it, which is the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below. So as I said before, we're always going to be working those puff stitches 2 rows below. So you can see here where the top of the puff stitch is versus where the chain stitch is. And since we're working 2 rows below, the puff stitch that we're making, you can see where the tops of those are. It's actually going to be working into the tops of the puff stitches 2 rows below. So we're just going to be repeating that all the way across our row. So we're going to be puff stitching into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below, and then chain 1, skipping over the working puff stitch, and again working a puff stitch into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below. And just repeat that all the way across your row until you have 2 stitches left. Okay, so I'm going to work my last puff stitch of this row. Chain 1, I'm going to skip this last stitch here and then work a single crochet into the top of the working row, just like that. And then that's the row that we're just going to keep repeating that over and over again. So we're going to start row 5 the same way that we started row 4, single crochet into the first stitch after you chain 1, and then start your puff stitches right here in the first stitch 2 rows below. And then chain 1, we're going to skip over the chain and puff stitch of our working row, and we're going to work our next puff stitch into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below, just like this. Okay, and then once you draw through all of those loops, you chain 1, and again we're going to skip over the puff and chain stitch of our working row, and we're going to work our next stitch into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below. And you can really start to see our braided puff stitch showing up for us right now. It looks awesome. So we're just going to continue that all the way across our row until we have 2 stitches left, and then you're going to chain 1 and single crochet into the top of the working row. And we're going to repeat this for a total of 9 rows. So once you get your 9 rows finished, meet me back here and I will show you how we're going to add on to either side of our tote in order to have the corner cutouts made. So I'll see you back here in a little bit. Okay, so I've gotten to the end of row 9, and you'll note if you're following along with the written pattern that you do not chain 1 and turn at the end of row 9. This is where we're going to be adding stitches on both sides of this little panel that we have so far in order to make these cutouts for our corners, which will make sense once we seam it together. So before we turn to start row 10, on this side we are going to be creating 8 foundation single crochet stitches. Okay, so to make my foundation single crochet stitches, I'm going to chain 1, and then I'm going to insert my hook kind of into the center of that last single crochet stitch that we made, and try to get through 2 of the loops. Yarn over and pull up a loop. Now normally for a single crochet we would yarn over and pull through both, but we're doing a foundation single crochet, so we're actually going to add an extra chain in there. So it's yarn over and draw through just 1 loop, then yarn over and draw through 2. Okay, so there's 1 foundation single crochet stitch made. Now we're going to go back again through the center, making sure we go through, we're going to go like into this chain stitch here, yarn over, draw up a loop, yarn over, draw through the first, and then yarn over, draw through 2. That's 2 foundation stitches made. So again, insert it into the extra chain stitch that you made, yarn over, draw up 1, yarn over, draw through 1, yarn over, draw through 2. That's 3 foundation single crochets. And we're just going to repeat that. So you go into that little extra chain stitch. That's where you're kind of like making your chain and then making your single crochet at the same time. So we have 4, 5, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so now we have 8 foundation single crochet coming off of our work. All right, so now we're ready to start row 10. So we're going to chain 1, and then we're going to turn our work. And kind of like our row 2, we're going to single crochet into the first stitch, and then we are going to puff into the next stitch 2 rows below, which is into the chain stitch here. And then chain 1, skip the next one, and then we're going to puff into the chain stitch 2 rows below. Chain 1, skip 1, puff again into the chain stitch 2 rows below. Skip 1, chain 1, skip 1, and then puff stitch again into the second, or the chain stitch 2 rows below. Okay, so we'll have added 4 puff stitches here. Okay, so then normally what would happen is we would single crochet into the top here and then puff into here, but we're just going to skip over that single crochet and we're going to puff stitch into the first stitch of our normal panel right here. So go ahead and puff 2 rows below, chain 1, and then we can repeat what we had been doing prior to that. So I'm going to be skipping over the working puff stitch and then making a puff stitch into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below. And then we're going to chain 1, again skip the puff stitch and work another puff into the stitch 2 rows below. And then we're just going to repeat that all the way across until we have 2 stitches left. And then I'll show you how we add on to the other side as well. So like can see here, we've made kind of like a little square almost right here, which will be our corner. So it's gonna kind of want to curl up on you for now, but as we keep going and adding more rows, it will start to lay more straight. So continue on working your row 10 until you have 2 stitches left, and then I'll meet you back here and I'll show you how to add stitches on the other side. Okay, so here we are at the end of our row, and we have 2 stitches left right here. So, but we want to add some stitches along here as well. So normally we have our chain 1 and then we would single crochet in here. But what we're going to do is we're going to pull our hook out for now. So I like to just kind of leave a longer loop and kind of push that yarn to the side so it doesn't get in the way. And then we're going to be adding some foundation single crochets over here. All right, so you can either work from a new skein or work from the opposite end of the current skein that you're on. And we're going to go ahead, and if you find the single crochet stitch 2 rows below, this is where our next puff stitch is going to be, but it's also where I'm going to join the foundation single crochet stitches. So I'm going to stick my hook through there, and then with my new yarn, I'm going to draw up a loop and chain 1, and then going through the side of that stitch, I'm going to yarn over and drop a loop. So I have 2 loops on my hook. And again, for my foundation stitches, I'm going to draw a loop through the first one and then draw a loop through both to make my first foundation single crochet. And then I'm going to go into that chain stitch I made, yarn over, draw up 1 loop, yarn over, draw through 1, yarn over, draw through 2. So I have 2 foundation single crochet stitches made. So again, same as the other side, I'm going to be making 8. So let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so now that we finished our 8 foundation stitches, I'm going to cut my yarn and draw that all the way through. Okay, so now I can insert my hook back in where we left off and continue on as normal doing my chains and puffs. So I already have my chain 1 here, and like I said, we're going to be puffing into the single crochet stitch but 2 rows below. Tight there, chain 1. We're going to skip the first foundation stitch and we're going to work into the next one, but going into the chain part, because we're going to work 2 rows below just as we normally would. Okay, chain 1, skip 1, again work your puff stitch into this chain stitch 2 rows below. Chain 1, skip 1, puff stitch into the chain 2 rows below. Okay, and then we're going to chain 1, we're going to skip 1, and then we're going to single crochet into the top of our last foundation stitch. So be careful here because this one likes to loosen up since that's where we pulled our yarn through. Okay, and so that will be the end of row 10. So we've added 3 extra puffs on this side and 4 on the other, but when we go and do row 11, we'll have 4 on this side and 3 on the other. So For row 11, we're going to chain 1 and turn. And then just as always, we're going to single crochet into the first stitch, and then we're going to puff into the first stitch 2 rows below. So that's our foundation stitch. And again, it's going to get kind of loose here. So once you finish your puff, just go ahead and pull on your end to tighten that up. And once we weave all these ends in, it'll be okay. All right, so then we've chained 1, we're gonna skip the puff and we're gonna work into the top of our single crochet from our foundation row. And then again, chain 1 and skip the puff and work into the top of the single crochet. And last one here. Okay, so now we're back onto our main panel again, and just as before, we're going to be working into the puff stitch 2 rows below. That first one can be kind of tricky to get into, so take your time here and then work your puff stitch. And then again, we're going to chain 1, skip the next puff stitch and work a puff into the next stitch 2 rows below. And again, we're just going to repeat that all the way across. So you can see we're just continuing on with the braided puff stitches. So I'm going to work all the way across, going into the edge here that we added, ending with my chain 1, skip this puff, and then single crochet into the top stitch here. So I'm going to go ahead and keep going, and then I'll show you kind of towards the end so you can at least see how that will look, since this row 11 is kind of a little bit tricky, kind of like row 10, just because we're reestablishing our row repeats here. Okay, so here we are at the end of row 11. So I've worked this puff stitch, I have a chain 1, and now I'm going to work my next puff stitch, which will actually be into the single crochet, like that last single crochet stitch from this first part of our panel. So it can be a little tricky to get our hooks in there, but go ahead and work your puff stitch there. Chain 1, skip this puff stitch, and then we're going to be working into the top of the foundation single crochet. 1, 2, 3. So if you need to slide over your puff stitches to get in there, oops, that's normal. And then after this row, everything will be pretty much smooth sailing from then on out. All right, so here's our last puff stitch of this row. Chain 1, and then we're going to single crochet into that first, or that last stitch. Okay, so here you can see that we started on this side with 4 here, and then 3, and on the opposite side we have 3, and then we have 4 before this little panel here. So you should have gone from having 46 stitches initially to now we have 62 stitches. And then we are just going to repeat that same row 11 over and over again until we have a total of 57 rows. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to continue on, and then I'll meet you back here and I'll show you how to finish off the top so that you don't have these little holes here from our chain stitches, and then we'll move on to the straps. Okay, so I've worked all of my rows and I'm almost done with my panel. So now we're going to be filling in these gaps here on row 58. And row 58, the right side will be facing you. Okay, so I've already chained one, and as always, I'm going to work a single crochet into the first stitch. And now for this row, I'm going to be working all single crochets. So wherever I worked a puff stitch, I'm actually just going to be working a single crochet. So into the stitch 2 rows below, the first stitch 2 rows below, right here into that single crochet, I'm just going to work a really tall single crochet, almost like a spike stitch. Then I'm going to, instead of chaining one, I'm going to single crochet into this chain stitch. So I know it looks like it's just the top of the puff stitch, but really this stitch is the top of the puff stitch and this is the chain stitch. So, but you can just kind of think of it as working into the top of the puff stitch. So work into the chain stitch and make a single crochet. And then here, when I would normally work a puff stitch into the top of this puff stitch 2 rows below, I'm just going to work a single crochet. And then again, single crochet into the chain stitch of the working row, and then single crochet into the puff stitch 2 rows below. Single crochet into the chain stitch of the working row, and then single crochet into the puff stitch 2 rows below. And we're just going to repeat that all the way across our work, and see we're just filling in that gap here, making us have a nice clean edge to work with. So once you get all the way across your row, you can fasten off, and then I will show you how to add your strap. Okay, so here we are at the end of row 58, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut off a pretty long tail. So that way I've already got something there for when I want to seam my panels together. So I'm just going to fasten that off, pull it all the way through, and there we go. So the majority of our work is done. We just need to add our straps and then seam our piece together. So what we're going to do for our straps is we're going to be reattaching some yarn. So here is along the top of our panel. This is row 58, and again with the right side facing. So I just worked row 58 across here. I fastened off on the end. I still have the right side facing me, and I'm going to count 17 stitches from the edge. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So I'm just going to stick my hook in there for now. So we're going to be working our strap directly onto our panel, and we're actually going to be working kind of over row 58 as well. So I am going to attach my yarn here to row 58 and draw up a loop to chain 1, and then I'm going to single crochet into that same stitch right there. Okay, so now we're ready to start working our strap, and we're going to kind of make it so that it looks seamless. It's just going to kind of come right off the top of our bag. So I'm going to be working my puff stitch where I normally would. So see how I have my single crochet stitch into the top of this puff stitch? I'm going to go right 2 rows below, working around the single crochet, and I'm going to work my first puff stitch into the puff stitch 2 rows below. So this will give us some added security to our strap since we're going around row 58 as well. Then I'm going to chain 1, skip the next puff stitch, and work my next puff stitch again into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below. Pull that through, chain 1, and then I'm going to single crochet into the top of our next stitch. Just like that. So I'm just working 2 puff stitches, and then I'm going to chain 1 and turn my work. Okay. All right, and then as normal, we're going to single crochet into the first stitch, and then we're going to puff stitch into the next stitch 2 rows below, or the first stitch 2 rows below. So that's going to be over here. 1, 2, 3. Chain 1, skip over this puff stitch, and again this can get a little bit tricky just because we've already worked into these stitches. I'm going to be working my puff stitch into the top of the puff stitch 2 rows below. Just like that. Chain 1, we're going to skip over the puff stitch, and I'm going to single crochet into that first single crochet stitch that we made when we started our strap. Okay, so we're just making 2 puff stitches in each row, and we're going to continue working those 2 puff stitch rows until our strap is as long as we like. So you can make your straps a little bit longer if you'd like. Okay, so then for row 3, single crochet into the first stitch, and now we're kind of back into our normal rhythm of things. So I'm going to puff stitch into the first stitch 2 rows below. Get my hook in there. 1, 2, 3. Chain 1, skip the next puff, and work a puff into the puff stitch 2 rows below. Chain 1 and single crochet into the last stitch, just like that. So here you can see this is how it's going to look, and it just kind of seamlessly goes up into our strap. Okay, and we're just going to continue to work these short rows of 2 puff stitches as we normally would until we have a total of 62 rows for our strap. And you are free to make your strap longer if you would like, or a little bit shorter if you'd like, as long as you're able to get all the way across the bag without it puckering and pulling. So just continue to repeat this same row until you have 62 rows, and then I will meet you back here and show you how to attach it to the other part of our panel. Okay, so I just finished up my row 62 of my strap. And what you're going to want to do is cut a fairly long piece of yarn for your end. I would say at least 2 to 3 yards. I know it's going to be a lot to work with, but we're going to use this yarn to create puff stitches as we attach it to the other side of the panel. And we're also going to be seaming up part of our strap with it as well. So make sure that you have a long tail of yarn, and then go ahead and fasten off and pull that long tail through your stitch. Okay, so what you're going to want to do, hopefully I can show this to you, I don't have a ton of room. We're going to lay our strap out so that there's no twist in it at all. We want to lay it out straight and then line up that edge with the other side. So it's all still that same panel. We made our strap over here. We've got it so it's not twisted. And now we've fastened off. We're on this right edge of our strap, and we're gonna go ahead and thread the ends onto a blunt, large-eyed tapestry needle. Okay, so again, it's gonna be a long tail, so it may be a little tricky, but we can do it. Okay, so from this edge, we are going to count over 17. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So this is where we're going to be attaching our strap. Okay, so we're just gonna go up through the 17th stitch and pull our yarn through. Again, it's a long tail, it's gonna take a little while. Pull that through, make sure you don't get it tangled, okay? And then I like to just kind of wrap it around one more time just to be safe and make sure that it's secure. So work slowly, make sure you don't get any tangles or knots in your yarn. Just like that. Okay, so we're going to be attaching our strap along this edge, but we want it to look seamless. So we are going to be using our needle and the end of our yarn to make puff stitches. Okay, so right here, this is the top of our stitch, right? So we want to work into this stitch down here, the one that's 2 rows below where we would normally work. Okay, so we're going to be making a puff stitch from here to here. So I'm going to go ahead and insert my needle into that stitch 2 rows below and draw it up right here underneath one of those single crochet stitch that we made into this puff stitch here. Ooh, whoa, we're getting a little tangled here with our end. So pull that all the way through, just like that. And then we're just gonna keep bringing it like this. So in this way, we're kind of just whip stitching, almost wrapping around multiple times to create the look of a puff stitch, but we're just using our needle and yarn. Ooh, okay, getting a little tangled up here. There we go. And you may get some knots in your yarn along the way, just go slow and careful. So typically with a puff stitch, you would yarn over and draw up a loop 3 times. So we want to go around our puff stitch at least 6 times in order to get the same look as the other puff stitches. So I think that was 3. So let's go around at least 3 more times. As long as you're making it look like the other puff stitches, you should be fine. So again, just take your time with it, go slow. Make sure you're not getting any knots. Go. All right, let's do one more. so I made my first little faux puff stitch here, and now I'm going to want to make my next puff stitch from here. So if you look at like where this puff stitch is leaning, this little stitch right here, and I also want to do it around here. So down here's the single crochet going into this puff stitch. So I want to do that, but in order to get over there, I'm going to bring this yarn around here and then up through this stitch here. Okay, and now I'm set up to work my next puff stitch going from here to here. So I'm going to wrap it around, going from the front to the back, and then bringing my needle back out through this top of this stitch here. And pull tight, and then we're going to do that 5 more times or more, depending on what our faux puff stitch looks like at that point. There's 3. 4. 5. And I may do a couple extra because this one's looking kind of small. I can try to get my yarn to lay straight. So just however many times you need to wrap it around in order to make it look like your other puff stitches. Kind of spread it out there. Okay, so now I need to work one more puff stitch, and that is going to be here to here. So in order to get over there, I'm going to insert my needle. I just kind of move it behind my work. Let's kind of go through both ends just to kind of give it that extra security. There we go. All right, and now we are going to do our faux puff stitch from here to here. So insert my needle from the front to back, around and out to this stitch here. Okay, and again, make sure that you're wrapping it around at least 6 times, if not more, so that you get that faux puff stitch look. Okay, so now I'm gonna kind of go up and around here and through this last end of our strap. And we just kind of want to secure these ends together. So going through the end of the panel and the end of the strap, wrapping around, and let's do that at least 2 to 3 times just to make sure it's nice and secure. Go through here one more time. Okay, and you can see that our strap just kind of blends in. It might not look exactly perfect, but that's okay. Kind of give the illusion that the panel just continues on right into the straps. Okay, so now that our strap is attached, again, we did that with the right side facing up. We are going to flip our panel over. Okay. And here, what we want to do, bring my yarn to this side. Okay, don't mind all my ends, I still need to weave in. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna be seaming the handle closed like this, all the way around, leaving about like an inch, inch and a half undone right here. So I'm just gonna go ahead and weave my yarn kind of like in through some of my puff stitches here until I get about an inch to an inch and a half up the edge. Can be a little tricky to get through all of those. So maybe about 3 puff stitches up. Draw your yarn through. Just like that. And then I can go ahead and draw it out this edge. A little knot there. And I can bring the sides together and start seaming it. And I'm just going to whip stitch the ends together like this. So again, be mindful when you're pulling your yarn through that you're not getting it tangled up and knotted. But we're just going to be seaming the edges of the strap together all the way around to the other side. Again, leaving about an inch to an inch and a half undone. So continue bringing the ends together. And again, we're working on the wrong side, so our seam is going to be on the wrong side of our handles. So just continue that all the way around to the other side. Okay, so I've made it all the way around and I stopped about an inch to an inch and a half from the end here. So now what I can do is I can weave in, I can make like a little knot here and weave in my end. We're gonna weave in all other ends except for if you left long tails here at the end for seaming, go ahead and leave those, but all of like these little ends here, go ahead and weave those in onto the wrong side of your work, and then I will show you how to seam your 2 panels together to make your bag complete. Okay, so now that we have both panels made all the way complete, ends are woven in except for these really long tails I have on either side. You're going to lay both panels together, right sides together. And then we are going to use our tapestry needle. I've already kind of gotten this end started. And I just like to whip stitch the sides together. Just how we did the straps. So just using a large blunt tapestry needle, going through both sides, both panels, just whip stitching all the way down the side. So you're gonna do seam both sides together, and then down here where we have these little cutouts, we're gonna leave those for now, and then we're going to seam all the way along the bottom. So you'll seam this side, the bottom, and the other side, and then I'll meet you back here and I'll show you how to do the corners so that we get that flat bottomed bag. But just go ahead and seam along both sides and the bottom, making sure that you are seaming both panels together, and then I'll meet you back here. Okay, so I have both sides seamed together and the bottom seamed together, and here we have this nice little square cutout. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna open up that square, and then we're gonna line up the bottom seam with the side seam and bring those together, and then we're going to seam all along this piece right here, and that's going to square up our bottom and create the corner of our bag. So I went ahead and left the long tails. I seamed from the top down and from this side over here along the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and I still have my tapestry needle attached. I'm going to whip stitch those seams together. And then using this tail, I'm going to seam this way. And then I'm going to take this tail and seam this way. And again, I'm just whip stitching these ends together. To create the boxy bottom of our bag. And make a little knot here at the end to make sure it's secure. And if you want to, you can always do this whip stitching part a couple times just to give you an added security. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to this other yarn tail here so that I can seam up the other side of my corner. So again, using the whip stitch. Making sure that I'm going through both ends of the panel. Making sure that's nice and secure. Okay, so you can see when we open it up again, I might put a few stitches here. It's looking a little holy there, but this is going to make the bottom corner of our bag. All right, so then I'm going to go ahead on the other end here and repeat that again. So here you can see the side is seamed here, the bottom is here. We take our corner and we just open it up, line up our side and bottom seams, and then using these two tail ends, we're just going to whip stitch the corner closed. So go ahead and do your second corner. Make sure that it's nice and secure how you want it. You can tie it off and weave in those ends, and then we can flip our bag right side out and I'll show you what we'll have at the end. Okay, so now all that's left to do is turn our bag right side out, making sure to push out those bottom edges and corners. And you will be finished with your Marlowe. You can see here our straps look nice and neat. This is the right side of the bag, and this little seam here for the straps is on the wrong side. So it makes a super cute, really big, high capacity tote bag. And you can get this as a kit from Lion Brand Yarn, or if you want to follow along and look at the written instructions, if you need some extra help besides this video tutorial, I'll put the links to both the free written pattern on my blog and the Lion Brand kit if you want to grab that as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoy this tutorial, and I hope that you enjoy your new Marlowe tote. Don't forget to like and subscribe.